The paper aims to analyze the notion of love or desire and its transformation in the works of Saint Gregory, the 4th century bishop of Nyssa in Cappadocia. First, the concept of Eros, further on desire, will be investigated in relation to Gregory's term diastema, which has different meanings. The concept of desire will be analyzed in the context of A, diastema as temporal interval which separates the present day from the second coming of Christ, then B, in the context of vertical diastema as a distance between good and evil, and C, in the context of diastema as inherent characteristic of created nature that never disappears. Second, transformation of desire will be discussed in 3 different theological contexts: ascetic, ethical, and eschatological. Third, the transformation of desire will be examined diachronically, that is, in the context of the works from different periods of Gregory's life, from the earliest to the latest. The paper consists of 3 case studies. The first case study deals with the relationship between desire and temporal diastema in the context of Gregory's early ascetical writing on virginity, dating from 371. The second case study is an analysis of the concept of desire and vertical diastema in the ethical context of the works from the middle period, such as On the Making of Man, the Hominis Opificio, Against Eunomius, Contra Eunomium 3, and the great catechetical oration, Oratio Catechetica Magna, that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s of the 4th century. The third case study refers to the mystical and eschatological context in which desire is associated with diastema, and it is restricted to Gregory's late works, Homilies on the Songs of Songs, In Cantico Canticore Homilia, on Perfection, De Perfectione, and the Life of Moses, De Vita Moisis, composed between 389 and 394. As the very term eros occurs only 9 times in Gregory's writings, I intend to analyze other terms, such as epithemia, that denote desire, love, or passion for something. For this reason, I'm referring to desire and not to love. But in Gregory, it's obvious that desire in many places can be identified with love for God. In his early work on virginity, Gregory describes the virginal life as an introduction to the philosophical life and a certain art and faculty of the more divine life, teaching those living in the flesh how to be like an incorporeal nature. During the elaboration of the main features of the virginal life, Gregory draws an ontological difference between the Holy Trinity and the creation. The virginity belongs to the incorruptible Father, who passionlessly begets the Son, who in turn may be known only through virginity, because his nature, as well as the nature of Holy Spirit, is pure and incorruptible. For Gregory, the virginity conceived in an ontological sense represents an essential difference between creator and creation. The main difference between divine and human nature is that the divine lacks desire and passions, apatheia, while the human nature is subjected to certain dispositions of the soul, such as desire and passions. The dispositions of the soul may be twofold. Gregory distinguished between lowly desires or passions, which are dispositions toward the corruptible realm, and lofty desires toward the incorruptible world that can be only achieved through the imitation of incorporeal powers. Therefore, the virginal or the philosophical life is the way to weaken physical passion and to discover the true desire. The true desire, rooted in our nature, in the creation, is the desire for heavenly things and for the union with God. According to Gregory, The natural movement, as endowed to human nature by the Creator, should be the fulfillment of lofty desires. This movement never stops, even if it does not derive from the lofty desires, but from the lowly passions. The human being, in its original state, didn't know for the passions. Thus, the human being became subjected to the passions, and that because he directed his movement not towards the incorruptible God, but towards the ontologically unstable and changeable creation. According to Gregory, after the transformation of lofty into lowly desires, and by clothing the human nature in the garments of skin, the path of human beings toward God became much longer. Gregory claims that the return of human beings to the original state is possible only if they come back to God by choosing the same path in which they fall away from Him. The last stop on this path is marriage, as compensation to human being for experiencing death, and as the ability to stay in life by continuing the species. Since the marriage is the last stop in the human separation from God, it should be the first stop on the way to Christ. Therefore, according to Gregory, the marriage should be replaced with the virginal life, because marriage is a life according to body that leads to death, while virginity is a life according to the spirit that saves from the death. The virginal life is an image of splendor that comes with the future age. According to Gregory, the virginity brings the gifts of the resurrection into this life, while through the procreation, the marriage distances people from the future age. Therefore, Gregory proposes a universal, for some too drastic, solution to replace marriage and procreation with virginal monastic life. For Gregory, the marriage is the only postponement of parousia, while the virginal life transcends time because it does not introduce distance, diastema, between the present day and the second coming of Christ by procreating new generations. Gregory links directly the desire for God with the distance that separates the present age from the second coming of Christ. The desire for God can be fulfilled only if the temporal diastema is shortened or totally abolished. The universal way to abolish this diastema and to fulfill the desire is to stop procreating. Thus, Gregory is convinced that Christ will be provoked to come earlier than he probably planned. Gregory argues for the reverse transformation of desire in this early work. The first transformation of desire consists in its redirection from God to corruptible nature. As a result of this transformation of lofty desires become lowly passions. As the reverse process of transforming the lowly into lofty desires, Gregory proposes a virginal life or abstaining from procreation. Thus, the passion to prolong the existence of human species for period, diastema, until the second coming by procreation, is replaced by the desire to provoke the Christ parousia by abstaining from procreation. In the virginitate, the virginal life, which abolishes temporal diastema, is the only solution proposed for the immediate fulfillment of the desire for God. A number of Gregory's works produced between the late 370s and early 380s, such on the making of man, against the eunomius tree, and the great catechetical orations, deal with the notions of being and non-being, or good and evil. According to Gregory, movement caused by desire is not simply one of the qualities with which God endowed creation, but it is the essential feature of creation. The doctrine of creation out of nothing indicates that God as creator moved the creation from the state of non-existence into being. Thus, this transition from non-being into being, the very nature of creation is changeable. Since nothing created has remained the same, it is in constant transition from one state to another. The created being oscillates between non-being, from which creation came to existence, to the fullness of being that is not reached yet by creation. This means that every created being is able to move within the existing distance, diastema, either back toward non-being, which is a change for the worse, or toward the fullness of being, which is a change for the better. From an ethical perspective, one may distinguish two kinds of movement. The first kind of movement, according to Gregory, is always toward good, while the other, which is in the opposite direction, is towards something that does not have its hypostasis. In order to underline that evil has no ontological foundation, Gregory considers that which is contrary to the good as absence of good. Thus, for Gregory, the evil has its existence in non-being. Gregory emphasizes that God is neither the creator of evil, nor is evil created together with the other things. On the other hand, evil is not an absolute non-being or nothingness, because then it would not exist, but it is relative to being. The vertical diastema, unlike a horizontal temporal diastema, may be thus defined as distance between good and evil. The movement of angels and human souls along the vertical diastema toward goodness is characterized by constant and continuous motion, because goodness is infinite and it cannot be reached by any pursuit. Gregory argues that these creatures are eternally and constantly moving, since their movement never stops. The creatures are moved by desire to reach the goal of their movement. The desire is the only causes of movement of the spiritual being toward goodness. The main reason for the movement of spiritual being towards something opposite to the beautiful or to the good is their perception of something opposite to the good as naturally good and beautiful. Therefore, according to Gregory, there is a beauty by nature, and as opposite, an illusory appearance of beauty. The criteria for distinguishing them are in the mind. However, the mind sometimes cannot determine what would be the right choice, and deceived by illusion, it chooses to move towards the non-being and evil, perceiving them as goodness. Gregory compares the human choice with the choice of the dog that abandons the real food in order to follow its shadow, hoping for a larger meal. In the case of human beings, the reason for moving towards evil is twofold. Primarily, this is a deception of the devil as the inventor of evil, and in the second place, the human acceptance of this deception. The movement over evil is movement away from God, and unlike the first kind of movement, it is limited, because evil is, as the lack of being, is not infinite. There are different scholarly interpretations regarding the limitation of evil. According to some scholars, just to mention Jean Danielou or Paul Semp, according to some claims, the evil is limited because it's related to the creator order. Some other scholars, like Canavé or Moshammer, reject such interpretation because it places the evil at the same ontological level with creation, a claim that is countered by Gregory. They offer an alternative interpretation of the limitations of evil from a soteriological perspective. Thus, the movement of beings toward evil would ultimately result in reaching the non-being. Therefore, the divine intervention in the form of incarnation and salvation of human nature happened when the limits of evil reached critical proportions. However, Gregory's denial of evil's infinity can also be interpreted from the aspects of the movement. Since evil has no ontological foundation, the movement toward evil would actually be the movement away from the good. The goal of the movement would be not in something, but away from something, and it would consist only in the desire to move away from the good. According to Gregory, movement towards something is a matter of free will, and if the will is not directed towards the goal of its motion, but toward the absence of the actual goal, it comes then to the cessation of movement. Since the being, by its nature, cannot stop moving, it must continue its movement in the opposite direction. Thus, the being that moves toward non-being will continue at one point its movement toward being by gaining again the goal of its movement. Therefore, Gregory argues for the absence of the final goal or of aspirations or stasis in evil. The desire for the fullness of being or good that is embedded in human nature causes the movement toward God. However, when the human being, due to deception, replaces the movement towards God with the movement away from God, he chooses the path toward evil as absence of good. The transformation of desire that happens in the movement toward evil is reflected in the weakening the very desire, because evil has no ontological foundation and therefore it cannot inspire further movement. By exhausting all the possibilities of evil as something unreal, the human being undergoes again the transformation of his desire into the movement towards God as goodness and fullness of being. Since the desire for God is the only real desire able to inspire continuous movement, the desire for anything other than God is therefore limited, and ultimately it is transformed into desire for God. A very optimistic perspective. Similarly, the vertical diastema between good and ill does not imply traversing the distance between two equal opportunities, but rather shortening the distance between achieved level of goodness and the goodness by nature. The evil is just a stop on this ethical diastema. In his later writings, such as De Vita Moises, De Perfectione, and In Canticum Canticorum, Gregory explored some mystical and eschatological themes. One of the fundamental questions that Gregory deals with is why the soul yearns to know what cannot be known. The question, which at first glance is paradoxical, actually reflects the quintessence of Gregory's late view on desire. Gregory's claim that Moses reached that for which he longed by unfulfilling his desire resolves the paradox. This claim should be considered on two levels, on the epistemological and on the moral level. The first level deals with the divine infinity that renders God unknowable, because the divine being cannot be comprehended by man due to lack of boundaries. Therefore, Moses' desire to know God remains unsatisfied. At the second moral level, Gregory argues that love towards the one who is beautiful and good causes movement toward him. Since the divine being is good by nature, God is the goal of every movement towards good. Linking the infinity of God with his goodness by nature resulted in movement toward good that never stops, because the desire of one who strives for God cannot be fulfilled. This movement is actually a spiritual growth in virtue or in perfection. Since God is the fullness of perfection, this again means that perfection cannot be achieved. Gregory explains further human motivation to persevere on this path that has no end. Gregory describes the mechanism of human desires and aspiration as something closed in a perpetual cycle of cosmological time. As soon as the human being satisfies his desire for something, by the possession of the object of his desire, he again begins to yearn for something else and again feels empty until he acquires it. Thus, every desire ceases when it reaches the object of desire, and as the desire reappears, it also disappears. If the desire is directed towards something that can never be achieved, then it cannot be satisfied. Thus, desire for the unattainable object never ceases. On the contrary, it constantly increases. Such desire is not characterized by successive iterations, but it acquires the permanence in which there is no cessation, because it does not attain the object of its desire. This continuity can be seen as a gradual increase in the intensity of desire. Thus, the human being departs from the perpetual cycle of changes, and he establishes his unstable nature on the stability of his determination. This stability is attained only on the way towards good, because it has no end, and any tendency that is the opposite to good has its limit, and it cannot maintain the stability of desire of movement. Therefore, human desire is defined by divine infinity and divine goodness. By moving towards good, which is God himself, the human soul realizes that God is unattainable because he is infinite, and that its desire to reach the good will never be fulfilled. However, while realizing her inability to reach the good, the human soul recognizes that reaching only a part of good is a significant advancement. Therefore, according to Gregory, the human being tends to advance on the way whose end will never reach. By continuous advancement toward good, the human desire to reach an infinitive goal is constantly satisfied by the achieved advancement. But it never ceases to strive towards that which lies ahead. Constantly moving towards good, human and other spiritual beings will constantly pursue the goal of their movement, although they cannot reach it. Therefore, Gregory argues that the perfection of human nature consists in its very growth in goodness. Gregory does not perceive the changes to which human beings are subjected as negative, but rather as a possibility for further human growth. The change represents a gradual movement in goodness, because the movement from glory to glory, according to 2 Corinthians 3:18, is the continuous advancement and the perfecting without reaching the fullness of perfection. Therefore, perfection consists in human continuous growth in goodness, which is without restriction. Perfection is therefore associated with a permanent increase of the desire to achieve goodness. By soul's ascent to goodness, the desire to attain it constantly grows. However, Gregory claims paradoxically that the constant movement toward perfection happens by standing still. Gregory draws identification of movement and stillness from Exodus 33:21, where Moses says, quote, "You must stand on the rock." If it is obvious that the one who ascends does not stand still, nor the one who stands still ascends, how then, Gregory asks, movement and stillness are the same? The solution to this paradox consists in the fact that human being ascends towards perfection in proportion to the extent of his steadfastness in goodness. By establishing himself in goodness, the human being actually achieves stability. The steadiness represents continuity of movement towards goodness, in which the movement assumes the character of stillness. Jean Danielou rightly remarks that this stillness, as one may establish in goodness, opens the possibility of movement as real advancement, while constant movement in physical world does not include advancement, and therefore it represents stagnation. Gregory describes how human being who is not establishing goodness, and who, in the words of the Apostle Paul, is tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind, from Ephesians 4:14, unsuccessfully tries to climb in the sand, because even though he makes long steps, his feet slip down. This is the answer to the initial question, how it is possible that Moses received that for which he longed by unfulfilling his desire. By establishing himself in the desire to reach God, he attained stillness, which both satisfied and increased his desire to continue the movement. Gregory's notion about Moses' unfulfilled desire may be the key to solve some difficult passages which puzzle contemporary scholarship, such as, for example, the commentary of the Song of Songs 15:6-8. Here, Gregory argues that in the beginning, when the created nature came into existence, through the divine power in each of the existence, the beginning was without distance linked to the end. That is, each of the creatures brought from non-being into being received, together with its beginning, its perfection. After this claim, Gregory offers an example of human being which, in the beginning, like other spiritual beings, did not have to traverse the way from its beginning to its perfection, because his nature was from the beginning created perfect. Since human nature was created in the image and likeness of God, it is endowed with the highest goodness and perfection. Gregory's argument in the commentary of Songs 15:6-8 raises questions because, contrary to his earlier views on the ever-existing created diastema, he claims that the beginning of the first creation coincided with the end, without any diastema between them, and that the nature began to exist as perfect. However, against the background of our discussion on Moses' unfulfilled desire, I would like to argue that the two positions are not contradicting each other. If the end of created beings is in the perfection, then they attain perfection by moving on the way to the fullness of perfection, which they can never attain. Thus, there is no diastema between them and their perfection, because their perpetual commitment to goodness brings them perfection. However, this does not mean that there is no diastema between beings and God, which exists due to the fact that the divine being can never be reached. By stating that at the beginning of creation, its beginning coincided with the end without any diastema in between, Gregory points to several issues. First, God, the Creator, made all things good and perfect without introducing between Him and creation anything that may separate them. The existence of diastema, which separates being from God, points rather to the divine nature, which is infinite and therefore incomprehensible for creatures, than to divine intention to create obstacles that separates God from creation. Therefore, as soon as the beings are brought into existence, they begin to exercise their perfect nature by their movement towards God that is also stillness from the point of perfection. Second, by referring to the being of creation, Gregory points that the creation did not exist in any other state than a state of perfection. This state of perfection is disturbed by the determination of spiritual beings to move towards something which is not the creator of their beings and the source of their goodness, on the basis of which they possess perfection. Then to the natural diastema, which represents more an inability to reach God than an obstacle intentionally established by the Creator, was added artificial diastema, created by creatures moving in the opposite direction from goodness. The imperfection, as a result of the abuse of freedom, began to exist in the originally perfect creatures, and at once their beginning became different from their end. The created nature has fallen from perfection, which characterized the beginning, and it was intended to serve as the end in their way to Creator. Gregory is explicit in stating that in the first creation there was no hindrance or obstacles impeding the development towards perfection of nature, because evil is not present, while in the second creation, diastema is attached by necessity to the first goodness. In his later works, Gregory points out that in addition to the horizontal diastema, as the period between the present moment at the end of the world, and to the vertical diastema as the distance between good and evil, there is a third diastema that is intrinsic and existed before the fall. This diastema actually consists in the human impossibility to comprehend the infinite divine nature. The existence of this diastema actually guarantees that the longing for God will never stop, because God cannot be reached or grasped. The transformation of desire happens when the goal of desire is redirected from reaching and grasping God to continuous and steadfast growth in Him. Therefore, the perfection is not achieved in reaching and grasping the divine being, because this is impossible, but in persistence to reach and grasp God. In conclusion, the desire for God and the diastema are two important concepts that can be found in various stages of Gregory's work. Throughout his works, Gregory explores and defines the notion of desire in connection to the diastema. Gregory presupposes that desire exists only when the object of desire is out of our immediate reach. This means that we are separated from the fulfillment of our desire either by spatial or temporal diastema, as it is the case with Gregory's earlier writings, or by ethical and ontological diastema, as he claims in his later works. In order to fulfill his desire, one has to reach the object he longs for by traversing the existing diastema. Therefore, in his early ascetic treatise on virginity, Gregory proposes to abstain from procreation as a means to abolish temporal diastema between the present age and Christ's second coming, and to fulfill the desire for Christ. However, in the writings from the middle period of his career, by facing the concept of divine infinity, Gregory transforms the horizontal temporal diastema into vertical diastema, as distance between good and evil. The longing for good becomes infinite because the object of desire is infinite. In this period, Gregory begins to identify the created nature with the diastema. Thus, the diastema ceases to be something that should be abolished, but it becomes something that secures the permanence of created nature on the basis of its desire to reach goodness. By the end of his life, Gregory again transforms the ethical diastema into ontological one. Diastema gains its ontological status when human beings realize that God as goodness cannot be achieved. Thus, one may build his perfection only on the steadfastness of his desire for God. Diastema itself, is inability to reach and grasp the divine being, ensures that the human desire for God will never stop and the human beings will constantly attain perfection. Even if at first glance it looks that Gregory is inconsistent in dealing with desire and diastema throughout his works, in my opinion there are no contradictions in his thought, because the transformation of both desire and diastema happen at different levels of reality and in different contexts of Christian life. Both diastema and desire for God undergo transformation because human and angelic beings pass from glory to glory in their continual advancement toward God. Thank you.